This is the Commander's Beacon. I'm Eric. We're here to talk about some unconventional ways to build your Commander deck. And today we've got a mono-white budget deck built around Halvar, God of Battle, and Sword of the Realms. Halvar, God of Battle, is a legendary MDFC from Kaldheim, so this is a double-sided card, and the face card is Halvar, God of Battle, a 4/4 legendary god that costs 2 white. It has creatures you control that are enchanted or equipped have double strike. And at the beginning of each combat, you may attach target aura or equipment attached to a creature you control to target creature you control. And if Halvar is your commander, you can also cast the reverse side of the card from your command zone, and this is an equipment, Sword of the Realms. Yes, that is right, an equipment in the command zone. Which is very cool, but it is mono-white, so temper your expectations appropriately. Now, Sword of the Realms is a legendary equipment that costs 1 and a white. It equips for 1 and a white, and it has equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has vigilance, and when the equipped creature dies, you return it to its owner's hand. So, Halvar God of Battle was spoiled way back in December of 2020. Now it's February 2021, Kaldheim has been released both on MTG Arena and in paper, so I've been thinking for a while about how to build this commander. If we focus on the front face of the card, we're playing, guess what, mono-white equipment. There's plenty of ways to do this, this is not a new strategy. Now, Halvar giving all of your equipped or enchanted creatures double strike is a very powerful ability, but again, you'll still be in mono-white, you'll still suffer from poor access to card advantage. As strong as Halvar's ability is, I'd rather just play SRAM if I really want to play a successful mono-white equipment deck. Now I thought about Sword of the Realms too. With sacrifice outlets and creatures with enter the battlefield effects, we can play a cool mono-white aristocrat strategy. Let's say I cast my Cavalier of Dawn so I get to blow up any non-land permanent that I want. Then I equip my Cavalier of Dawn with Sword of the Realms. Then I sacrifice it to Ashnod's altar. It dies so I get to return an artifact or enchantment from my graveyard to my hand. And Sword of the Realms returns Cavalier of Dawn to my hand so I can cast it again, and blow up another permanent and so on. Now every time I do this loop, I need to spend 5 mana to cast Cavalier of Dawn and 2 mana to equip it. Now Ashnod's altar refunds 2 of that mana, but it's still 5 mana for each cycle of sacrificing and recasting Cavalier of Dawn. And if my sacrifice outlet doesn't generate mana, then it costs me even more. And in my playtesting, I found that despite the value we can generate by sacrificing and recasting creatures with powerful enter the battlefield effects, it takes a bunch of mana. I mean, you might do nothing with each of your turns during the mid-game except sacrifice a big creature like that Cavalier of Dawn, and then recast it again and equip it, and then you're probably out of mana. So I guess the good news is that you won't actually need card draw, since you won't have the mana to play most of the cards in your hand. But the bad news is you won't really develop your battlefield. In a typical aristocrat strategy, you'll want to go wide with a bunch of small recurable creatures and creature tokens, and you generate a bunch of on-death triggers. But with Sword of the Realms, we only get value from a single creature dying at a time, the one that was equipped with the sword. So we theoretically want our mono-white aristocrat strategy to go tall instead, with large creatures that have powerful enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield triggers that we could repeat. But again, this will require pretty much all of our mana, since we'll need to repeatedly cast and equip those creatures if we sacrifice them when they're equipped with the Sword of the Realms. And this strategy just wasn't working for me. So I decided to focus on smaller creatures that can simply benefit from Sword of the Realms as protection to let them attack aggressively, and if they die, they just come back. Creatures like Auriok Glavemaster, a 1-mana 1/1 human soldier that gets +1/+1 in first strike as long as it's equipped. So if we equip it with Sword of the Realms, it's a 4/2 with vigilance and first strike, and if it dies, it goes back to your hand and you can just recast it for a single mana. So by focusing on cheap, efficient creatures like Auriok Glavemaster, we can impact the board sooner, and we can actually play more of our cards. And while we'll still use some creatures that like to be sacrificed for value, we're not going to build completely around it. So we'll still find value in casting Halvar to give all of our equipped creatures double strike and really put pressure on our opponents. So this deck is built to utilize either side of our commander. The There's plenty of decision points here in determining when you want to cast Halvar and when you want to cast Sword of the Realms. We have plenty of equipment to let Halvar give our creatures double strike, but if we need some protection and resilience, then we can utilize Sword of the Realms along with our sacrifice outlets and value creatures to maintain our board presence or give us some resilience against board wipes and things like that. And I decided to make this deck a budget deck for a couple of reasons. First, lots of these creatures that have a low mana cost and get stronger when they're equipped, well, they're very inexpensive, and to be honest, they're not really that competitive in a highly tuned meta. Secondly, Halvar is still mono white and doesn't have card advantage on it, and because card advantage is still an overwhelming weakness of white, most mono white builds will struggle to compete at higher power levels, no matter how many expensive swords you buy for your deck. So as a result, I've decided to build this Halvar deck on a budget and for lower power level play. I would rate this deck around a 5 to 6 at the power level. But that's enough of the introduction. Let's get into how the deck works. First, let's mention some of our creatures that just like to wear equipment and beat face. Skyhunter Cub, Sunspear Shikari, Core Blade Master, just to name a few. These guys all love to wear equipment, and they get even better if they're equipped when Halvar is on the battlefield to give them double strike. Of course, Core Blade Master already gives itself double strike if it's equipped, so Halvar isn't particularly useful for this specific creature, but it still wears Sword of the Realms pretty well. And we've got plenty of other creatures that are good at attacking or blocking when they're equipped, but they're pretty straightforward, so I won't discuss them all here. But please see the link to the deck list in the description for more details. But speaking of creatures that don't need Halvar to get double strike, Heavenly Blade Master is a 3/6 angel that costs 6. It has flying and double strike. When it enters the battlefield, you may attach any number of auras and equipment you control to it. And other creatures you control get +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to Heavenly Blade Master. So this is easily one of the most powerful creatures in the deck. And if we have Sword of the Realms on the battlefield, it'll auto-equip for free onto Heavenly Blade Master when it enters the battlefield, so Heavenly Blade Master has some built-in protection right away. Not to mention a 5/6 flying vigilant double striker is pretty decent. And it's even an anthem for the rest of your team. Loyal Unicorn is going to protect our team and let us attack without consequence, which is exactly what we want to be doing. This is a 3/4 Unicorn that costs 4. It has Vigilance, and it has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to creatures you control this turn. Other creatures you control gain Vigilance until end of turn. So notably here, Loyal Unicorn can be turned off if our opponents kill our commander. Now if we've got Halvar in play, that'll be pretty easy, since the Kaldheim gods don't have any built-in protection like Indestructible. But what if we've got Sword of the Realms in play? Artifact removal is a bit harder than creature removal, and it only costs 2 mana, plus the commander tax of course, to recast it. Your opponents likely won't want to waste removal on Sword of the Realms unless they've just got an abundance of it, or unless perhaps you're really abusing Sword of the Realms at the moment. So Sword of the Realms is much less likely to be removed than a creature like Halvar, and so Loyal Unicorn is going to be harder to turn off. Arden Intrepid Archaeologist is probably the best ramp we're going to get in a mono-white equipment deck. This is a 2/3 that costs 3 mana, and it lets you move any number of auras and equipment you control onto one of your creatures at the beginning of combat on your turn. And the mana savings that this generates is pretty big, especially for using Sword of the Realms a lot to kill and recur our own creatures, since we'll need to re-equip those creatures every time they get recurred and recast. And finally we've got Auriak Steel Shaper. This is a 1/1 for 2 mana, and it reduces our equip costs by 1. And this helps with any equipment deck, but it really makes a difference here since, again, we might be re-equipping Sword of the Realms constantly if we get one of our sacrifice and recursion loops going. But we're not just beating our opponents to death with equipped creatures, we're also taking advantage of the sacrifice and recursion effects that we get from Sword of the Realms. Now let's talk about the creatures that really benefit from our sacrifice and recursion strategies using Sword of the Realms. Fairy Guide Mother is an adventure creature. You can cast the adventure part of the card. This is a sorcery that gives a target creature +2/+1 and flying until end of turn. Now, this is a sorcery, so it can't be used on defense, but it will help you get in for combat damage against opponents that don't have flying blockers. Then you can cast the creature afterwards for a single mana. It's a 1/1 flyer. Now, if you equip Fairy Guide Mother with the Sword of the Realms and then sacrifice it, it goes back to your hand. So then you can cast the adventure side of the card again. So you're kind of recurring 2 cards in 1. Of course, Fairy Guide Mother can't sacrifice itself. It either needs to chump block in combat or you need a sacrifice outlet. And we do have a few of those, which we'll talk about later. But speaking of adventures, we're going to do the same thing with Giant Killer. The adventure side of this card, a Chop Down, is a 3-mana instant that destroys a creature with power 4 or greater. Then we can cast the creature for a single white mana. We equip the creature with Sword of the Realm, sack the creature or just let it die in combat, and we get our kill spell back to our hand. Now, Burnished Heart is really silly with Sword of the Realms since it can sacrifice itself. You cast it for 3 mana, then you equip it with Sword of the Realms. You pay 3 and sacrifice Burnished Heart to get 2 basic lands from your library onto the battlefield tapped. And Burnished Heart goes back to your hand so you can do it again. Now you're going to need those extra lands because you just paid 8 to ramp 2 lands, but you can make those payments in installments, and Burnished Heart can block a creature on its way out, so yes, this does cost a lot, but it's also pretty good value and pretty good repeatable ramp, especially in mono white. There's Benevolent Bodyguard, a 1-mana 1/1 that can be sacrificed to give one of your creatures protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So this can let you get past blockers or avoid targeted removal. And again, equip Benevolent Bodyguard with Sword of the Realms and it's reusable. We mentioned Hope of Ghirapur, another 1/1 for 1. This artifact creature has flying and you can sacrifice Hope of Ghirapur so that until your next turn, target player who was dealt combat damage by Hope of Ghirapur this turn can't cast non-creature spells. So this can lock down a player from casting non-creature spells indefinitely, and for only 3 mana each turn, as long as you can equip Sword of the Realms to Hope of Ghirapur and get in for combat damage. And finally, let's talk about Protector of the Crown. I try not to use too many high converted mana cost creatures in this deck, or at least high CMC creatures that like to die and recur with Sword of the Realms. But I'll make an exception for Protector of the Crown. This is a 6-mana 2/5 giant that makes you the monarch when it enters the battlefield. And it says all damage that would be dealt to you is dealt to Protector of the Crown instead. So this guy protects you from single big attacks like Aetherflux Reservoir or a big combat step led by something like a Craterhoof Behemoth. Of course, this will kill Protector of the Crown, but yep, we're just going to recast and re-equip him. Seems good. And as long as he's around, your opponents can't deal combat damage to you, so they can't take the Monarch from you. And again, you're in mono white, so you'll really appreciate that card draw. And as long as we're trying to squeeze as much value as we can out of Sword of the Realms, I want to mention Exert. Exert is a mechanic from the Amonkhet block, and if a creature has Exert, you can choose to exert that creature either as part of an activated ability or when it attacks, depending on the creature, and an exerted creature won't untap during its controller's next untap step. So you'll generally do something powerful with that creature when you exert it, but it'll have to take its next turn off since it won't untap. Unless, of course, it exerted itself by attacking, and if it has vigilance. For example, you can exert Devoted Cropmate as it attacks, and when you do, you get to return a creature with CMC 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. But if Devoted Cropmate is wielding the Sword of the Realms, it won't be tapped when it attacks since it has vigilance, so you can use it again next turn. So you get to recur a cheap creature from your graveyard every single turn. So this is kind of like Alesha, but you don't have to pay mana for the effect. And you don't even care if Devoted Cropmate dies, since its ability triggers on attack, and Sword of the Realms will just return it to your hand, even if it dies in combat. So this is just a really cool synergy between Exert and Vigilance, and since we have Vigilance in the command zone on Sword of the Realms, we can really take advantage of it here. But Sword of the Realms is not our only piece of equipment. We'll use plenty of other equipments to help us overwhelm our opponent's defenses. Now, if we were only playing with Sword of the Realms, we wouldn't really need other equipment in our deck. But if we want to finish out games, we may need to rely on Halvar's ability to grant double strike to our equipped creatures for that extra push. And for that, we'll need a well-equipped team. Now, lots of decks will play defensive equipment like Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves, but our creatures are small, so we can easily cast them repeatedly if they die and get returned from our graveyard with Sword of the Realms or any other effects. So we're going to focus mostly on equipment that increases our creatures' power and gives them some sort of evasion to maximize the value of that double strike that Halvar generates for them. Onaginata, Forebear's Blade, Loxodon Warhammer, all of these grant trample and +3 to power. And when Halvar adds double strike, then even our tiny 1 and 2 drop creatures can turn into pretty sizable threats. Let's take Auriak Steelshaper as an example. It's a 1/1, and when it's equipped it gets +1/+1. So if this guy is wearing a Forebear's Blade and Halvar is on the battlefield, then it's a 5/2 with double strike, vigilance, and trample. And because of the double strike, we don't really care too much about the low toughness, and most small and medium-sized creatures won't even be able to trade with us in combat. Now, we're also running equipment that grants haste, because casting a creature, gearing it up, and then waiting for the combat step on our next turn is not going to win us too many games. We already mentioned Swiftfoot Boots, but we'll also run Strider Harness and Sword of Vengeance for the haste. Finally, we do use a few utility equipment. Even though we're playing a budget deck, I've made room in the budget for Skull Clamp. This is an obviously good card. It's amazing card draw, and again, we're in mono white. We absolutely need amazing card draw. And with our sacrifice outlets, our recursion, and our 1 toughness creatures, we'll be better able to abuse Skull Clamp repeatedly. We'll also run Infiltration Lens and Rogue's Gloves for more card draw. We want to be attacking a lot, so whether our opponents decide to block us or not, at least one of these equipment will help us keep our hand filled. Finally, we've got a couple of budget equipment tutors in Open the Armory and Relic Seeker. Now, Relic Seeker is interesting here because if we equip it with Sword of the Realms and it dies, we get it back to our hand, where we can recast it and maybe get another equipment tutor out of it. We've got a few hoops to jump through to reuse Relic Seeker's tutoring ability, since it has to get in for combat damage first, but it is at least possible. So we've covered our aggressive creatures, our value creatures, and our equipment. Let's talk about some of the other choices we've made for card draw, removal, lands, and support cards that work particularly well with this deck. So our deck wants to use Sword of the Realms with our sacrifice outlets to repeatedly recur and recast creatures for value. And while we're not going full aristocrats, we are running a few effects that let us sacrifice our creatures for value on our own terms, and hopefully recur them if they were wielding that Sword of the Realms. We've already mentioned Skull Clamp, which is sort of a sacrifice outlet that lets us pay 1 and sacrifice a creature with 1 toughness or less to draw 2 cards at sorcery speed. We've got 8 creatures that can be instant killed by equipping Skull Clamp, and note there's also a few 1 toughness creatures that can't. Auriak Glavemaster, for example, has 1 toughness, so the -1 to toughness from Skull Clamp would kill it, except it gets +1/+1 when it's equipped, so it won't. Now we'll also run Martyr's Cause. This is a white enchantment that costs 3 mana, it lets us sacrifice a creature, and the next time a source of our choice would deal damage to any target this turn, that damage is prevented. We'll use Fanatical Devotion. This is another 3 mana white enchantment, it lets us sacrifice a creature to regenerate target creature. Not only is this another 0 mana instant speed sacrifice outlet, or at least the cost to sacrifice a creature to it is 0 mana, but it can also really help us shrug off board wipes, especially when combined with Sword of the Realms. Finally, we'll use Claws of Gix. This is a 0 mana artifact that simply lets you pay 1 and sacrifice a permanent to gain 1 life. That life gain will be mostly negligible, but this is a fairly cheap sacrifice outlet that enables our Sword of the Realms combos pretty reliably. Now we'll use Sword of the Realms to help us with sustain and recursion, but we've got a few other ways to help keep our stuff out of the graveyard for too long. Brought Back is an instant that costs 2, and it lets us return to the battlefield up to 2 permanents in our graveyard that were put there this turn. Of course, we'll use the classics, Sun Titan and Revelark, to help us recur our permanents from the graveyard as well. I also want to mention Oketra's Monument. This is a 3 mana artifact that makes our white creature spells cost 1 less. And whenever we cast a creature spell, we make a 1/1 white warrior creature token. So making this extra token is fine, it does give us fodder to use as chump blockers, but if we start sacrificing and recurring creatures with Sword of the Realms or any of our other effects, then this cost reduction to recast those creatures will really help us out. So our deck wants to use Sword of the Realms with our sacrifice outlets to repeatedly recur and recast creatures for value. But we also want to use Halvar to help us close out games. So we're running a couple of methods to help us return our commander to our hand from the battlefield, so that we can recast the other side of the card if we need to, and this will help us to avoid commander attacks. Shepherd of the Flock, for example, is another one of those adventure creatures. The adventure part of the card is a 1-mana instant that lets us return a permanent we control to its owner's hand. So if I've got Sword of the Realms on the battlefield but I want Halvar now, Shepherd of the Flock can facilitate. And of course we can also cast the creature, Shepherd of the Flock, for only 2 mana, and again if it dies we can recur it and then we can use the adventure again. But I want to talk about Sanctum of Eternity. This is an amazing land. It taps for colorless, but we can also pay 2 and tap it to return our commander to our hand. Now the specific wording is pay 2 and tap it to return target commander you own from the battlefield to your hand. Activate this ability only during your turn. Now note that it says commander you own. This means that even if an opponent steals your commander, Sanctum of Eternity can get it back. And also notice that it targets your commander. It doesn't target a creature. So you can use it either to return Halvar or Sword of the Realms to your hand. Now, of course, we can only use the ability on our turn, so we won't be able to use it to protect our commander from board wipes or targeted removal by our opponents, again, unless they cast those spells during our turn. Other notable lands we're playing include Rogue's Passage, Bonder's Enclave, Seagate Wreckage. Rogue's Passage is an obvious include in a combat-oriented deck. Bonder's Enclave and Seagate Wreckage help provide some desperately needed card draw, even if it's inefficient. I wouldn't rely on these all the time, but they can be useful in an emergency. Now, as long as we're sacrificing, recurring, and recasting our creatures with Sword of the Realms or our other effects, we can use Stonehaven Outfitter and Mentor of the Meek for consistent card draw. Stonehaven Outfitter draws us a card whenever an equipped creature we control dies, so this works perfectly with Sword of the Realms. And Mentor of the Meek lets us pay 1 whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under our control, and if we do, we draw a card. And many of our creatures will have power of 2 or less, at least until they're equipped. Now, we'll also run some specific removal that synergizes with our deck. Citywide Bust is a 3-mana sorcery that destroys all creatures with toughness 4 or greater. Most of our creatures will not be hit by this, even after we equip them. So this can often be a one-sided board wipe that can devastate our opponents, but it won't do too much harm to us. Do note that it does kill Halvar though. Dusk to Dawn is similar. Dusk is a sorcery that destroys all creatures with CMC 3 or greater for 4 mana. Now we've got 17 creatures with CMC 2 or less that will not be affected by this. And the Aftermath side, Dawn, returns all creatures with CMC 2 or less from our graveyard to our hand. And again, we've got 17 such creatures in this deck. Austere Command is similar. This is a 6-mana sorcery that lets us choose 2. Destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, destroy all creatures with CMC 3 or less, and destroy all creatures with CMC 4 or more. So again, since we have a lot of cheap creatures, we can pick modes that will hurt our opponents much more than us. So that is the deck, but let's go over the deck stats and cost. At the time of this recording, this Budget Halvar build is coming in at $67.70 on tcgplayer.com. The deck is fairly low to the ground with an average CMC of 2.73. We're running 35 lands. We have 32 creatures and 12 pieces of equipment. There are 7 sources of card draw, or I guess 9 if we count some of the lands that can draw cards inefficiently, like Bonder's Enclave. And we've got 8 pieces of ramp. There are 8 single target removal spells and 4 board wipes. Alright, so that is my budget build for Halvar and Sword of the Realms. So again, this is a pretty casual deck. It's easy on the budget, it should be pretty easy to play. But it still has access to some subtle and sneaky maneuvers with its sacrifice outlets and its recursion. And there's still some interesting decision making when piloting the deck, in choosing when to play for value with Sword of the Realms, or when to be aggressive by using Halvar. But that's all I've got for today. We'll have a couple of more upcoming deck techs from Kaldheim soon. We'll go over Esseka, God of the Tree, and Carter, Doomscourge, and perhaps any others that come up between now and then. Please like this video or subscribe if you found any of this useful. I make commander-focused content showing you all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.